Silly Willy Goes Mountain Climbing. One evening, when Silly Willy had finished his homework, he was looking through a stack of books trying to decide what he wanted to read next, when he overheard his parents talking in the living room about a telephone call they had just received from his Uncle Rocky in Chicago. His mother was saying,
"He said he was planning on a mountain climbing trip to the Grand Tetons in Wyoming next month, and he would like to take Silly Willy along with him. Gee, I don't know. It sounds dangerous to me."
"Oh, I wouldn't think that Rocky would take him on too difficult a climb for his first trip," said his dad. "You know, they do have a climbing school there, and they make sure everyone knows how to climb safely before they let them go up on the mountain. It would certainly be a wonderful trip for Silly Willy, and he would be out of school then, too. I kind of think we ought to let him go."
Well, Silly Willy couldn't just sit there and listen to this conversation. He ran into the living room and shouted,
"Oh, gosh, Mom, can I go, please? I'll do everything Uncle Rocky says, and I'll be real careful, too."
Well, after several minutes of arguing and discussing, it was finally decided that if Uncle Rocky really wanted to take him, Silly Willy could go, but they would have to get busy getting his clothes and stuff together, for it was almost next month now, and Uncle Rocky wanted to leave in just 1 week.
"Oh, boy!" shouted Silly Willy, and he dashed into his room, dragged out a suitcase from under his bed, and started stuffing clothes into it. He was so excited he could hardly sleep that night, and for the next week he and his mother were busy shopping and sorting, and then packing and repacking his suitcase. Then, finally, the day came to leave, and his parents drove Silly Willy to the airport, where he got on a plane going to Chicago. Once there, Uncle Rocky would meet the plane, and they would then transfer to another plane that would take them to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where they would rent a car and drive on up to the Grand Teton National Park. What an exciting trip it was! And then, one afternoon about 5 o'clock, they drove on into the park and stopped in front of the mountain climbing school. They went inside, where a ranger greeted them, saying he had been expecting them, and they would be starting out early the next morning with their backpacks. He suggested they go into the little dining room and eat a good supper, and then go get some sleep, because the climbing would require all of the strength and stamina they had. At 6 o'clock the next morning, the ranger, whose name was Joe, hollered out,
"Okay, you rookies, up and at 'em. We've got pancakes on the griddle, and we pull out of here in just 1/2 an hour."
Silly Willy and Uncle Rocky jumped out of bed, scrambled into their clothes, gobbled up stacks of pancakes, and at 6:30 were ready to move out with Ranger Joe, who first made sure that Silly Willy had on his climbing shoes and his special belt with the strong metal rings on it, to be so that they could be clipped to a rope if necessary.
Gosh, exclaimed Silly Willy, we're finally actually climbing. And he looked upward towards the huge snow-capped peak that was their goal. It seemed a long way off, but right for now, his mind was busy just making sure he didn't slip on a loose rock on the narrow trail they were following. By noontime, they could look back towards Ranger Joe's cabin and were surprised to find they had climbed quite a long way already, although the mountain peak didn't appear any closer. Ranger Joe stopped by a stumpy little fir tree where he said,
Okay, men, let's stop here for a bite of lunch and a short rest. From here on, there isn't much of a trail, and the climbing gets steeper.
After their rest, off they went again, and Ranger Joe was right. It was tougher climbing. Sometimes he had to grab a hold of scrubby bushes or rocks to pull himself up where it had become too steep for his feet alone to do the work. By nighttime, Silly Willy was just exhausted, and he began to wonder if he really should have come along after all. But after a good supper, he settled down in his sleeping bag near a small fire and felt much better. He enjoyed listening to Ranger Joe and Uncle Rocky talking about some of their past experiences on the mountain. Ranger Joe was saying,
Remember the time we discovered the famous old mountain goat the Indians used to talk about? They had named him King Billy because he had ruled the other goats on the mountain for so long. King Billy had become a legend,
for he had been smart enough to always find food and shelter for his herd, even when blizzards and heavy snows had just about killed off all the other animals. They even said that King Billy could talk if a person could just listen the right way.
"Oh, come on now," said Uncle Rocky. "I think sometime your stories go a bit too far. But let's cut the gabbing and get some sleep."
During the night, a light snow had fallen, so that when he got up in the morning, Silly Willy couldn't even see the faint trail they had been following. And since the mountain was really getting steep now, Ranger Joe had them clip ropes on their belts so that all three of them were tied together, just in case one of them slipped. The others could save him from sliding too far down. It was more fun climbing like this, but a lot more work too, because they had to carefully plant each foot in a secure place before putting weight on it, and sometimes they sought out little crevices and cracks in the rock beneath the snow to give them a place to grip with their fingers. Now they were getting fairly close to the top, and the snow was deeper, and the air so thin it was awfully easy to get out of breath. So rest stops became more frequent and longer. Later on in the afternoon of the second day, Ranger Joe said,
"Come on, you two. Do you see that little flat spot right up near the top? There it is. We've got to get there before dark, because that's the only safe place for us to put up our small tent for the night."
It seemed to Silly Willy to be a long way still to go, and he was so tired he was slipping a lot, and Uncle Rocky and Ranger Joe had to sort of hand him along on his rope. And then, just as they were climbing up the last steep slope to the flat place where they could spend the night, all of a sudden, Rocky hollered out, "Watch out! Here comes a snow avalanche! Hang on to each other's ropes! Don't let..." But the rest of his voice was blotted out as the huge slide of loose snow fell over all three of them. For a while, all Silly Willy could do was keep snow away from his nose and mouth so he could breathe. But soon he was able to poke a hole through the snow and crawl out. But his rope that was tied to Uncle Rocky and Ranger Joe would not move. At this moment, when everything seemed so bad, Silly Willy started to cry. But then he told himself, "Hey, don't give up now." So he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. There, not 10 feet away, stood a huge gray-white mountain goat that was looking right at him and was bleating, "Ba, ba, bleep, bleep, blaffersnaff," over and over. The same sound, "Ba, ba, bleep, bleep, blaffersnaff." Then, suddenly, Silly Willy remembered Ranger Joe's story of the talking goat. So he turned his head, grabbed an ear with his fingers, and twisted just a little. And amazingly, the next time the goat bleated, he actually heard it say, "Quick, give me your rope unsnapped." As in a dream, Silly Willy unsnapped the rope from his belt and held it out to the goat, who he now knew must be King Billy, just as Ranger Joe had told him. King Billy grabbed the rope with his teeth, and then reared back on his hind legs and pulled with all his strength. He pulled and yanked and tugged until gradually both Uncle Rocky and Ranger Joe were slowly pulled from underneath the avalanche. Silly Willy was overjoyed to see both men waving and smiling as they now stumbled up to where he was sitting.
"Thank God you're all right," said Uncle Rocky. "That sure was a close call. But how did you ever manage to pull both of us out from under the snow?"
"I didn't do it," said Silly Willy. "It was King Billy, right over there. Oh gosh, he's gone. But he talked to me, and I handed him my rope, just like he asked, and he did the pulling." A few minutes later, Ranger Joe had pitched the tent and warmed up some tea and opened a couple of cans of stew, so that before long all three were warm and safe. Ranger Joe said,
"I think perhaps we had better head back down in the morning. It looks like we could get more snow, and I guess we've all had enough mountain climbing for one trip."
Next morning, the sky was gray and threatening, so they wasted no time. They packed up the tent, rolled up their sleeping bags, tied them into their backpacks, and started down. Going down was much easier than climbing up. They were still just able to see where they had stopped and held on, so that by evening they found themselves back at Ranger Joe's cabin, where they all enjoyed a good meal and a hot shower. The next morning, Silly Willy and Uncle Rocky
said goodbye to Ranger Joe, they jumped into their car and headed back to Cheyenne, where a plane soon took them to Chicago. There, Silly Willy said goodbye to Uncle Rocky and said,
You know, no one will ever believe me when I tell them about King Billy and how he talked to me and then saved your life and saved Ranger Joe's life too.
Well, Silly Willy,
I know you couldn't have pulled us out by yourself, and you know what you saw. So that's that. Don't ever let anyone shake your belief in what you know happened.
This proved to be good advice, because when his mom and dad met him at the airport in Chattanooga, he told them about his strange experience on the mountain and of King Billy, but you know, they didn't really believe him. But that night, Silly Willy was talking in his sleep, and his mother heard him say,
Bah, bah, bleep, bleep, blow snap.